All right, last class we talked about the Spanish-American War. Ran down through how it started. Can anybody tell us anything about how it started? Let me rephrase that. Who is going to tell us something about how it started? Only one question, Stephanie. Do you want this one? All right, she'll wait. You're allowed to look in your notes. It's perfectly justified, perfectly allowable. If your notes aren't worth looking at, you can look at your neighbors. There's no cheating at this point. Caleb.
Let's start with the Cuba one and how it's independent.
Okay, we talked the background there, the Cuban fighting for independence and America definitely on the side of the Cuban people against Spain. So we had this predisposed dislike for Spain. Okay, what two events pushed us over the edge? Okay, those two events there, February of 1898, pushed us over the edge. We have the resolution in Congress and then a declaration on April the 25th. In the scope of things, a very quick war. We have the treaty by the end of the year, by October. We have a treaty signed, the war over, and America now having substantial possessions overseas. All right, really a new position for us. And that's what I want to talk about here first today. America's handling of its foreign possessions. What do we do with the Philippines, with Cuba, with Guam, with these places that we acquired in this war? What do we do with them? There was, in a certain sense, people of the world watching. This was new. We were just coming onto the world scene. How are we going to handle this situation? I think I read you the quote by McKinley that's in our textbook about him saying we could turn over to France, we could do this or that, and finally came down to, well, there's nothing really left. The only legitimate option was for us to keep it and civilize and Christianize them, was his response. This next quote is also from our textbook. It's not him quoting somebody else. This is actually the author's words. Never in history had a nation so willingly and in general so peacefully rescinded control over so much territory and so much conquered people as in the case of the possessions taken in the Spanish-American War. For the most part, this stuff is turned back over to the people that live there. They don't have to wage a bloody guerrilla campaign like the Cubans against the Spanish. It's turned back over to them, right? And really, in world history, very unusual for that to be done willingly. And America has done this multiple times, all right, where we conquer someplace and we turn it back over to the people. I mean, Japan is a good example from World War II. The sections of Europe that we occupied at the end of World War II, we turn those back over. We don't carve out an American colony in Europe. That would be that'd be fun. Get back at them people over there. All right, but that doesn't happen. We turn it over, right? Turn it over, almost to a fault in some cases. With Cuba, I think, to a fault. We made some mistakes there. All right, I want to look at that process. But the basic point is we are very nice to these people. We put all kinds of effort into this, and we turn them loose. Do not let people make you think about America as this evil imperialistic nation. That is not true. It is not true even nations like England that were very imperialistic. It is not fair either to describe them as evil. All right, the places that they colonized for long periods of time did very well under that rule. So it would be fair to completely criticize them, but we didn't even do that. All right, let's look at these places. The first one we'll look at is Cuba, and then we'll look at the Philippines. Those are the two main ones, and then we'll just, in passing, mention Puerto Rico and Guam, a little bit that takes place there. But let's talk about Cuba first. All right, the first point is, following the war, we have a direct military occupation of Cuba. For 4 years, it was under our military's control. The commanding general in charge of Cuba was a guy named General Leonard Wood, if you want his name, Wood, W-O-O-D. And during that time frame, America, at our expense, does all kinds of work in Cuba, rebuilding roads, building sanitation systems, building hospitals, building schools. The whole we hear today about infrastructure, rebuilding the infrastructure of the country, or maybe in a lot of cases, building the infrastructure. It would be unfair to say it was all destroyed in the war. It wasn't there. All right, building this infrastructure there at our expense. We did all this work. We also do a lot of work with health and disease. A man named Dr. Walter Reed is involved here in Cuba, multiple year effort to try to figure out yellow fever. Eventually figures out it comes from a mosquito when they narrow down the mosquito, and they begin to wipe yellow fever out there. So anyway, under this time of military occupation, we spend a lot of money and effort, and spend a lot of money and a lot of time and effort here rebuilding the country, preparing it to stand on its own. All right, so that's the first point. Direct military occupation for 4 years. The next point is started in 1900, which is before that 4 years is over, but starting in 1900, we started making steps to make Cuba independent. All right, the initial step here that comes through Congress in 1900 is called the Platt Amendment, P-L-A-T-T Amendment. If you're familiar with how Congress works, I'm not sure if you're better off or not for being familiar with it, but if you are, this was an amendment to the Army Appropriations Bill. All right, Congress, a bill that funds the Army, nobody wants to vote against. So it's very common for members of Congress to tack things onto that bill as an amendment because who wants to be the guy that votes against paying the soldiers? Nobody wants to be that guy. All right, so the amendments don't have to deal with the soldiers at all. I mean, Jacob could say, I think there should be a school in my home district named after me. Like the Jacob Martin Penitentiary or something. We could, and you could stick that on the appropriations bill, and it'll ride through on that. So that's how this makes it through Congress. Not that there was super opposition, but it goes through that Congress that way. That's why it's called the Platt Amendment. It's not its own independent law; it's an amendment. All right, this thing laid down a couple of guidelines and rules dealing with Cuba. All right, the first one is it said that Cuba cannot enter into a treaty with another country that gave up its independence or gave up its territory. All right, so, as we were in the process of setting them free, we were saying that we're not going to allow them to go back to Spain and make some treaty with Spain and become a colony of Spain again. We want them to be independent, and this Platt Amendment lays out that guideline. It also restricted the amount of debt that Cuba could acquire. The government, it didn't restrict the people, the government of Cuba. We should learn the same lesson ourselves. We didn't want to let them get so far into debt that other countries would be able to influence and exert control over them because they owed them money. We should learn to that. Okay, the third thing is that we maintain the right here. We're occupying them, but as we turn them loose, we are maintaining the right to come in and intervene if it was needed. If there was a riot that broke out and the government was losing control, we were saying we would come back in and help settle things down and then turn it back over. Not coming to take over, but we would come in if needed. And then also it allowed for us to lease some naval stations in Cuba. There's a very famous one that we still have that Obama wants to get rid of. Guantanamo Bay, Gitmo. Right, we have a bunch of the terrorists there today. We got at this point, so we've had it for a very long time. Okay, so 1900, we have the Platt Amendment laying out some guidelines here as we make plans to turn Cuba free. All right, then it was May of 1902 that actually happens. They have an election prior to this point, and it was May of 1902 that the president of Cuba takes his position and the government of Cuba begins to operate under their rule. And at that point, the American troops leave. All right, there's some other things that happened that we need to mention at that point. But 1902, Cuba is free. If you think about, 4 years prior to that, we conquer them. And in 4 years, we spend all kinds of money, all kinds of time and effort, and then we turn them free, May of 1902. Okay, there's some other things that happened that we need to mention here. There were several times where we did have to go back and send in U.S. troops to quell a rebellion or something going on there. We did not want to allow the situation to deteriorate and become anarchy. And these intrusions, so to speak, by Americans were not, the Cuban people didn't hate that. I mean, they were saying, hey, we need some help. This is something they were wanting. So it's not like we were imposing ourselves against their will. We were imposing ourselves, but it was, they were asking for it. So there's several times over the next really 30 years that some problems come up and we have to step in and intervene and get the government setting back on a firm foundation. So in 1933, things change. In 1933, we get one of the greatest presidents in all of American history installed. And I just became a heretic. That's when FDR comes into office. Very, very socialist president. Bernie Sanders makes him look like a conservative, though. But anyway, FDR comes in office. In 1933, there's a revolution in Cuba. They throw out the existing government. Some new guys take over. And FDR decides not to do anything, decides not to intervene. So we have this for 30 years or a little bit more than that, that when that type of thing happened, we would go down, get rid of the insurgents, get the right people in office. He decides to not follow through with that. So the Platt Amendment at this point gets abolished. If not actually the words in practice, it is gone. Okay, so it was 1933 where we kind of jettisoned the claim that we had maintained that we could intervene there to make sure they did stay free. All right, and then if we run ahead a little bit later, in 1959, we have another revolution, and that's when the communists take over. If we had maintained that presence there and the ability to intervene, that could have been a very, very different story. So 1953, Fidel Castro takes over. Did I say 53? 59. 59. Yeah. Raul Castro is his brother. I don't remember hearing that he officially died. He's on life support or something right now. Anyway, they're both very old people. But he comes in 59, 60, we break off diplomatic relations, and we're the same way. Prior to 59, we had very, very good relations with them. A lot of trade back and forth. Americans would go there and build hotels and resorts and things like that. But obviously that all stops in 59. So I think I mentioned Milton Hershey in Cuba with some building some sugar plantations and things like that. That would have been in this time frame before the revolution. So. All right, so Cuba. There, the mistake I think we made was we should have maintained kind of that supervisory role to make sure the communists didn't take over. I mean, and not so much for the Cuban people, for our own national security. This is right off of our coast, and now we have a communist nation. And very shortly thereafter, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis and some very significant things happening. They don't go completely haywire like they could have, but some significant things. All right, so that's Cuba. Questions there? Yes?
At what point was the Bay of Pigs disaster?
That was after 59. That was...
63?
That sounds right. I can find it. I should have it memorized. 61, April 17, 1961. Cuban Missile Crisis was 62. All part of JFK's manly approach to foreign policy. So, okay. Philippines? Let's talk about them. The first point I have here is that the Philippines were a very much more complicated situation than Cuba. Can anybody think how the Philippines would be different? The spelling, things like that, but more than that. Distance, I mean, it's across the Pacific Ocean. This is very far away. That, I think, is the primary difference. Also, we have a very much more complicated situation. With Cuba, we have an island of Cuba. With the Philippines, we've got this whole cluster of islands, somewhere around 7,000 islands scattered across that area. Obviously, not all of them major islands, but very much more complicated situation there. The distance, the islands, different cultures, different ethnic groups, very much more complicated situation. So, but I think it comes out much better than in Cuba. All right, second point is, much like with Cuba, we start after the war here directly ruling them. And again, don't think here that we are, storming in with our soldiers imposing this. I mean, we were welcomed as heroes, having driven out the Spanish and giving them some freedom. So we began to directly rule them after the war. The first man who is installed there to run the government is William Howard Taft. Anybody know that name? Becomes president later on. All right, he is installed there as the civil governor. So here now, in Cuba, it was a military commander that operated this thing. This was a civilian. He wasn't a military commander. But he comes over and organizes the government. Officially, he comes in 1901 to take his position. That was authorized, if you really want some minutia, by another amendment, the Spooner Amendment. And then at that point, and even prior to that, we did the same things that we did in Cuba. Rebuild their infrastructure, build hospitals, build schools, build roads, all kinds of things like that. Sanitation systems. If it doesn't seem like a big deal to you to have a functioning sewer system, plug your main line out of your house and just live for a while without a sewer system. We take it for granted. But building those types of things for multiple years. And also, I guess I should mention, lots of Christian missionaries coming over. We talked about even McKinley saying we need to Christianize them. All right, so we have that for a while. The progression here to them becoming independent is slower than it is in Cuba. Welcome to class. All right, let me give you a rundown of the progression. The first step is in 1907. 1907, we have the Filipinos beginning to elect an assembly to assist making laws. We are in the middle of the Philippines. It might be easier just to let us finish up this section. You can just get the whole section from somebody else. 1907, they began to elect an assembly to assist making laws. We still had the governor, picked by the president and that type of thing. But they began to having some representation. 1916, they expand that assembly into two different pieces. They add a Senate to it. So we have that legislative body expanding, both in representation, in the people that get to vote, in their authority, that thing expanding. So that was 1916. We still had the civil governor, Taft. It wasn't him anymore, but that position there, still he had the executive authority, but they began to have more of a say. 1934, we have another law passed by Congress saying that we were going to turn the Philippines free by 1946. Now again, we're running through some years here. We acquired this in 1898, but they're saying 1946, we're going to turn them free. And that was 1934 that was stated. And amazingly, we did that. In between there, we have World War II. The Japanese invading and occupying the Philippines, and MacArthur coming back and driving the Philippines out, and us nuking the Japanese and all of that. And still, it was July the 4th of 1946 that the Philippines are set free. So complete Philippine independence, the Republic of the Philippines. Okay, and unlike Cuba, with the Philippines, we continue to have very good relations, even to this day, with the Philippines. Doesn't sound too much like imperialism to me. And I don't think it would have been completely unfair to ask these places to pay for everything. But we didn't even do that. I mean, we're building hospitals and schools, but we didn't do that. We sucked it all up. Okay, Philippines become independent 1946. All right, briefly, let's talk about Puerto Rico and Guam. These two places are not independent. They're still U.S. territories, but they have some similarities for sure. In both cases, we see the islands occupied and run directly by the U.S. government, by the national level. And in both cases, we have the same infrastructure and schools and roads and sewers and that all of that infrastructure being rebuilt or built in some cases. And slowly through the years, they go from being territories that have been conquered to U.S. territories, and the people living there become U.S. citizens. If you want Puerto Rico, it was 1952 that they become an independent U.S. territory, and the people there become citizens. They actually become citizens prior, but 1952, completely independent. And then in Guam, it was 1950. Guam's another one. They get conquered by Japan, and we reconquer them in 44. So, yep.
Can you read, restate the date?
It was 52 for Puerto Rico and 50 for Guam. Okay. There are some laws that passed that kind of walk them through that, beginning to pick legislatures and things like that, but I think that's sufficient. Again, both of those are still U.S. territories. Puerto Rico and Guam. Okay. So a very good record. Not that we're perfect, but a very good record of handling overseas possessions and not just trying to amass an empire. If it had been the Soviet Union that occupied the Philippines, we'd have another Iron Curtain. It'd been tough to build that Iron Curtain around all those islands, but they would have figured it out somehow. So. All right, questions on that? All right, let's go from something that's uplifting and encouraging to talk about how good we did to us becoming incredibly stupid. Right? The progressive era. All right, what is the time frame that we're talking about? Lawrence?
1900 or 1901.
1901. 1901 to 1921. And what are some of the glorious things we get in the progressive era? I am saying that greatly with sarcasm. Yes? Direct election of senators. Prior to that, senators were chosen by the state legislatures. Now we have a general election in the state, which we will talk about that, but that completely upset the whole balance of power and structure of our government. Anything else? Nobody knows?
World War I.
That is in there, but it's not, that was a separate issue really. But it's true, it's in the middle of that time frame. Everybody's filing these things right now. Well, not everybody, but lots of people. Income tax. All right. It wasn't there on a national level prior to this progressive era. And we're missing the potentially most damaging one. Stephanie doesn't want to give that one. Man's suffrage. Women's suffrage, women voting. But women's suffrage makes it, sounds like they're suffering. It's really man's suffrage. We are suffering. But women voting. And we get a whole bunch of changes there. I'm mostly joking about the women's suffrage, but some very, very bad changes come out of this progressive era. Looked like I had a question. Okay. The first thing I want to do is try to wrap our minds a little bit about what progressivism is. All right. Don't wrap your mind around it too much because it hurts. But I want us to have at least a little glimmer of their reasoning and how they view the world. And we'll anyway, we'll look at some of the laws and things that changed. And even with their reasoning, I still don't think they make any sense. But at least I want you to understand a little bit of where they're coming from. Okay, these are bad ideas, this whole progressive idea. Hillary Clinton claims she's not a socialist, she's a progressive. That'd be like saying, I'm not a... I'm not a what?
Not a communist or a Nazi?
Yes, or maybe I'm a Bolshevik, not a communist, or something like that. It's real hard to separate the two. Right? But she claims to be a progressive, hearkening back to this era. That she claims she's continuing to live this philosophy, which is extremely damaging to America's whole system and completely ungodly. So, all right, the first thing I want to do is give you the two main ideas, two philosophical things that drive this whole agenda, this whole progressive philosophy. All right. The first one is that there are no fixed truths. There's no absolute truth. They intentionally reject en masse our founding. All right. Can anybody think of any documents from our founding that talk about fixed truths? Doesn't use that phrase, fixed truths. Constitution, and prior to that? Bill of, not much after that, but that little document that declares our independence. Declaration of Independence. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. All right, these are fixed. They don't change, right? And they rejected that out of hand. It's completely disregarded it. So no self-evident truths. They didn't believe in natural law, if you're familiar with that term, the idea that there's a natural order to the world. We accept that in the physical world. You know, you go up on top of a building and you throw a bowling ball off. We're not surprised when it falls. Hopefully you're not surprised. There's the same type of natural laws that govern people and how we operate and what we think about. As Christians, that natural law would include a sin nature and how we sin and do wrong because of our sin nature. It's not because we lived in a house where the paint was peeling off. It's our sin nature. So reject that. This is one of the progressive men. He said, "No man who is well abreast of modern science, as the fathers were of the 18th century, believes any longer in unchanging human nature." He's saying the people of today that understand science as well as the founding fathers of America did today realize that they were all wrong. There's the whole philosophy of the founding is messed up. All right, one other thing here with this no fixed truths. This one is a fixed truth that I guess they accept. The individual is subordinate to the state. The government is more important than you. You know, your right to live and have property and to pursue your own happiness, that takes a second place seat to the government. If the government decides that it wants to do something that just arbitrarily strips some of that away from you, that's okay because you're not as important. Right. So anyway, no fixed truths is the point there. There's no absolute truths. We can't run to the Bible and say this is what God says. It all is up in the air, and really it changes. Each generation gets to kind of reestablish and figure out what is the truth and how it fits with their society and their thinking. That's a little bit unsettling, but no fixed truths. All right, the second idea, there's a term for this one. It's called historicism. I'm not sure why they call it historicism, but historicism, Historicism. Basically, this says that ideas from the past are no longer relevant. You know, at the time of the founding of America, this idea of self-evident truths, that was good. But in 1900, that's 100 and some years old. That no longer has any bearing on today. So that you can't learn from the past. You can't go back to, you know, the Roman Republic and look at what undermined it. All those things, the past is only relevant for the past. There's no bearing on today. We can't learn from it. We can't take any ideas that they taught or thought. It doesn't apply. Let me give some quotes here. These are all by Wilson, one of our president. "Some citizens of this country have never gotten beyond the Declaration of Independence. that document that here continues to quote, did not mention the questions of our day and is of no consequence to us. It was our president. I like the president that defended the Bible better. All right. Here's another strange one. Government is not a machine, but a living thing. It falls not under the theory of the universe, but under the theory of organic life. It is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. It is modified by its environment, necessitated by its tasks, shaped to its functions by the sheer pressure of life. This is not a theory, but fact. It displays its force as fact, whatever theories may be thrown across its track. Living political constitutions, the U.S. Constitution, must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. He's talking about the Constitution needs to be allowed to evolve and change. Now, we wouldn't use the term evolve and change, but there was a mechanism to change the Constitution if it was needed. He's not talking about amending the Constitution. He's talking about taking the same phrase and just redefining all the words to mean something else. Let it evolve and change. This Constitution, later on in history, all of a sudden has a right to an abortion in it. And now we're told a right to gay marriage in it. Right? I challenge you to find that. It's very difficult. It's not there. But with this idea that it's Darwinian, it should be allowed to evolve, it really doesn't matter so much what the words were meant to mean when they were written. It's kind of like, let's just let them change, and whatever we think they should mean now is what they should mean. Isn't it somehow corrupting evolution if we allow people to interpret it? Isn't that men are always evil, right, girls? All right, let's go on. Living political constitutions must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must obey the laws of life, not mechanics. It goes on and on. I think that's enough for the quote. All right, so this historicism, these ideas from the past, they don't really mean anything to us today. They were good then. They wouldn't argue necessarily that these people were stupid. They're just saying that those ideas don't help us today. They don't have any bearing on us today, which is completely wrong. How many can think of a document that's relatively old that has some significant bearing on us today? The Bible, they would say, oh, well, it was written 2,000 years ago, and it had some great ideas, but those might not all transfer to us today. We've got to reevaluate and redefine all the things in there. So very, very bad idea. Historicism. All right, so those are the two main ideas that are behind this thing. There's no fixed truths, and ultimately we can't learn from the past. There's nothing back there that really applies to us. We've got to figure this thing out all on our own. Right? The next thing here, I saw this under progressivism and trying to wrap our brain around a little bit. We have those two are kind of the governing underlying ideas that drive this whole thing. The next thing is some other results of that. So, taking those two ideas and applying them to life, some other still kind of ideas, but more concrete things that we get out of this. We're going to look at some very concrete things in a little bit and look at laws that get passed in this vein. But here's some ideas that are based on those two philosophical foundations. All right, the first one is there's no real limit on what the government should do. It's whatever the people think it should do. If we think the government should provide people to tie our shoes for us every morning, then the government should do that, right? If maybe the government should mandate, instead of providing people to tie shoes, that we all have shoes without laces. Some of you are fine. So we can do Velcro or slip-ons. Who's ready for Velcro shoes again? But there's no limit, all right, to what the government should do. To progressives, and I'm including Hillary in this, the Constitution, we look at it, the Constitution is a problem, all right, because it limits. It says the government can't do these certain things. And it gets in the way. Our current president, Barack Obama, has talked about the Bill of Rights as a list of negatives. It's a list of things the government's not allowed to do for us. We're hemming in the government. It can't do all the good that it really can. We look at it as a list of positives, areas that the government's not allowed to mess with because they belong to us. Right? So a very, very skewed view of things, and our Constitution in particular is a problem that has to be overcome. And it really is that trying to overcome the document where they have gone to the courts to get some judge to rule, like gay marriage is legal. And it's a constitutional right, supposedly, because they know that anybody that actually reads that document is never going to find it, right? Because it's a problem. So anyway, no limits on what the government should do, not based on the Bible, not based on natural law, not even based on the Constitution. All right, the second thing here is the progressive always wanted more popular participation in government, not more popular people involved in government, but more popular participation. More people involved, more people voting, more direct election of senators. The prior system where they were chosen by the state legislatures was not popular enough. There wasn't enough of a direct vote by the people. So we need to switch that. More direct primaries, which is appropriate for today. Situations where all the people in the state vote to choose the candidate for the party, as opposed to the party leadership getting together and choosing a candidate. Now, these are private political parties. They can do it however they want to, really. I mean, if the Republican Party in Indiana want to say we're going to take all the county chairmans and let them pick the candidate, it's a private institution. They can do what they want to. But these people are saying that would be bad. We need to let all the people vote. So more of this popular participation. The third thing is they wanted a scientific system of running the government. They felt if they can get the experts in charge of the government and give them free rein to organize society and weed out corruption, that we'd have this very, very efficient and good system, a scientific system. Really, the whole oh, there it is. This quote comes up in our next point, but I'm going to read it here. This idea of the government setting up experts to orchestrate things. He says here, this is Edward Ross, a progressive, removing control further away from the ordinary citizen and taxpayers, tantamount to giving the intelligent, far-sighted, and public-spirited elements in society a longer lever to work with. So we're going to take the experts in farming and put them in charge of the agriculture of the country. And by insulating them from the people by multiple layers of government, it gives them this longer stick to pry things and move it where they want to. So this scientific approach to government. It's kind of funny that they talk about wanting more popular participation, and then the other hand say we want a scientific government run by experts. Those two seem to be at odds with each other. Okay, so scientific system. One of my favorite presidents is Calvin Coolidge, and he, all through his presidency, was cutting taxes and cutting expenses, and major efforts at cutting expenses, trying to trim things down. But he even, him and his advisors used this phrase, a scientific approach to spending, and they weren't using it here in the same vein, but you can see that term even transferring up into the mid and late 20s. This scientific approach. So anyway, scientific approach, basically a government run by experts, this giant bureaucracy of experts. All right, the next point is centralization of power, the power being consolidated in one central organization, for us, the U.S. government. The quote I read you was referring to that as well, have this longer lever to work with. And man, have we gotten carried away with that. I know I've mentioned this several times, but it still boggles my mind that a couple weeks ago, Congress was debating what the lunches should be here in Chesterton in the public schools. I mean, that's think about the insanity of that. But we have so much power consolidated in Washington. That's something they loved. All right, and the last thing here in these ideas that come out of those two foundations is a living constitution. A living constitution. We shouldn't look at the Constitution as being a set, constant document. It needs to be allowed to grow to address the issues of the day. I wish I had a living mortgage. Maybe. Depends on who gets to decide how it grows. I want to decide how it grows. and this whole idea is really, really stupid. Imagine if we had a living syllabus and it was allowed to change, and maybe the book critique that is supposed to be 2 pages in length, after you turn the paper in, I say, well, according to our living syllabus, that 2 really was representative, and somehow come up with the idea it's supposed to be a 10-page paper. And I grade your paper based upon it being 10 pages, this living Constitution. You would come back to me and say, no, Mr. Reinhardt, it's right there. It's written, 2 pages. How can you do that? And I'd say, oh, it's a living document. Right? And you would look at me very justly and say, you're insane. Okay. And that should be our response to people that argue for this living Constitution. Are you insane? There's black and white words. I mean, they mean something. All right, it doesn't evolve. It's a document. It's not living. But anyway, a living Constitution. All right, questions about that? That's kind of the philosophical, trying to wrap our mind around it. The 2 undergirding foundations, no fixed truths, and we can't learn from the past, the sources. And that underpins the whole thing. And that other list of things are kind of offshoots of those ideas. So, anybody in government class? We still hold these truths, addresses the progressive philosophy. You'll get to rehash this. Potentially, if you read the book. So. Hopefully you read it. So, all right, let me give you here I have all that as underneath kind of a description of progressivism. The next thing I still have there, but a little bit more of just a little bit of the history and some people involved, just a little bit more of the nuts and bolts, mechanics of this thing. The first thing is that this progressive movement, progressive party, progressive thing, was very broad and very varied. It was broad and varied. Let me cut out a varied in there. It involved people from both parties, people from different walks of life. It was all over the place as far as who was involved in it. We've got Theodore Roosevelt, a progressive, a Republican. We've got Wilson, a progressive, a Democrat, all over the place. Geographically, this party or this philosophy starts in the part of the country we're at, and west, the Midwest and the West. It didn't come out of the East Coast. It came out of the West and Midwest. Primarily, some of the early leaders were senators and members of Congress from this part of the world. If you want, Robert Lafayette from Wisconsin, a guy named Hiram Johnson, a guy named Cummings. Johnson's from California, Cummings from Iowa. But the West and Midwest is where we see the leadership of this movement starting. So, and then it ends in 1921, with Harding advocating what he called a return to normalcy. All right, you say, enough of this insanity. Return to normalcy. And I have a quote here out of our textbook that I think is pretty good. This is referring to the progressive era. Now, I don't agree with all this. It says women could vote, but now they couldn't drink because we banned drinking. They could start businesses, but could not expand these companies lest they fall prey to antitrust fervor. You could start a company, but if it got too big, the government was going to attack you. Likewise, men found that progressive policies had freed them from the dominance of the state legislatures when it came to electing their senators, but then learned that the states lacked the power to insulate them from arbitrary actions by the federal government. Well, that's a lesson we should learn today. Voters could recall their judges, but at the cost of allowing them to make tough, unpopular decisions. They could initiate legislation, swamping ballots with scores of legal-sounding and unfathomable proposals. An income tax held as the measure to redistribute wealth succeeded in only taking more and more wealth than ever from the least able to pay it. Small wonder that in 1920, Americans, for the most part, were ready to ditch progressivism. All right, there was return to normalcy. Enough was enough. I don't know that we're quite ready for that today, but we need a return to normalcy as well. Okay, so progressive, the philosophy, the ideas, questions on that. It's a tough thing to nail down. If you ever heard the phrases like nailing Jello to the wall or something. Because if you read some of these progressive ideas and things, they're it's such a varied group of people that you get all kinds of things. But if you go back to those two foundations, no fixed truths, and we can't learn from the past, that's the underpinnings for all of it. Somehow we can run it back to those two ideas. It gives us at least something a little more concrete, since we're talking about a foundation to rest our thinking on. All right, questions there? Is anybody still awake? Matthew is now. I wasn't sure a little bit ago. He was digesting what I had said. He didn't want to distract himself with actually seeing things. So. I don't know. It looked like your eyes closed, but maybe you were typing. So. Olivia, I wasn't sure about either, so she was digesting as well. Meditating deeply. Yes. All right, let me introduce the next thing we'll talk about, and I think we'll wait and save it for next time. We talked about the philosophy of the progressive idea, the progressive era. The next thing we want to do is look at actual changes that were made to our government. All of that we talked about was just ideas. We're going to now look at how our government was changed. And here's where we get the direct election of senators. We get women's suffrage. We get the trust busting that was alluded to in the quote, the income tax, the Federal Reserve System. Those all changes made to our national level. And then we'll look at some changes made to the states and so on down the line. There's a wave of very bad changes based upon this progressive philosophy that really, the wave maybe is not a bad phrase to think about. It just overwhelms our government, and we're just getting inundated with this idea after idea of some really damaging things. I should do it sometime. I thought about on the final listing 3 or 4 of these, and the essay would be, pick the one that did the most damage. All right. There's 2 that would be hard for me to argue about, the direct election of senators and the income tax. It'd be hard to pick which did the most damage. Probably just for fun, for the guys, I'd put women's suffrage. You could argue about that doing the most damage. Or maybe you girls could. You could say, man, us women are emotional and we don't think straight. And who in the right mind would give us anything to decide? You could argue that if you wanted. But really, there's some great damage done to our system of government here. Guys, don't forget that I'm married. And she's stuck. You want to at least pretend like you like girls for a little while. Until you get married. So, all right. I like my wife, and I really am joking mostly. Questions? It is true that women are emotional and don't think straight, right? The fact that you don't see that is evidence.
I think it depends on what you mean by straight.
Like we do. Guys think straight. Yeah, and girls don't. So however we think is straight.
Well, I'm just saying, like, you're straight in their minds, maybe crooked or something.
So, all right. Next time we'll pick up talking about these changes that were made, and then go on and talk about Theodore Roosevelt.